Welcome back to Gold News, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kerry Stevenson. Today, I've asked Jonathon Payne, author and founder of the Payne Report, that's paynereport.com.au, to join me here. Why? First up, Jonathon will be our keynote opening speaker on day 2 of the Australian Gold Conference. Now, Jonathon has had decades of experience in the international investment markets. He has lived all around the world. He's led teams in Bahrain, in London, also here in Australia. But I've spoken to Jonathon over the years. I've known him for a number of years, and I like his macro view. Right now, you all know, we're living in very volatile times, scary times. The market is all over the place. Where are we going? Is it inflation? Is it stagflation? Is it whatflation? Who knows? Jonathon, great to see you. I really appreciate your time coming and joining me on Gold News today.
No, thank you, Kerry. And it's an absolute pleasure to be with you this morning.
Well, recently, I wanted to open up with this. You did a recent tweet which said, "We face a new geopolitical reality, a new axis of autocracy. Do we need to talk about stagflation? When the facts change, I change my mind." So what facts are changing and what is changing your mind?
Well, Kerry, I think all the facts are changing. And of course, you're quoting the eminent British economist, John Maynard Keynes, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And I believe the facts are changing very, very rapidly indeed. In your introduction, you highlighted my belief, which I've now written about for some time, that we are witnessing today a new axis of autocracy with both Russia and China at its core. And I think we could then continue that statement with the fact that we are witnesses to a new geopolitical reality. So let's just cast our mind back just a couple of months, Kerry. On February the 4th, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping met in China, and they made a joint declaration in which they highlighted that their friendship has no limits. On the 24th of February, of course, Vladimir Putin and the Russian army invaded Ukraine. So the end of the day, we are witnesses to an extraordinary rupture, in my view, in the kind of architecture of the global order. And I think we really need to wake up to that new reality.
When you say we need to wake up to that new reality, the majority, the man on the street, the people going about their business, especially here in Australia, we almost seem to be a little bit immune to all of that. Is it going to be affecting us? And at the end of the day, my community out there, they're looking at how they can protect their wealth and grow their wealth. But it's extremely volatile. Are you saying that, I guess the question I want to ask you is, what should we be doing? If it's changing so rapidly, what do we do?
Yeah. Well, exactly. It is changing very, very rapidly. So I think the first kind of broad brush observation that I would make, and then I'll try and draw some conclusions out of this. The first observation really is that since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we have witnessed now for many decades the ever increasing integration of nations. Now more latterly, we're witnessing an ever increasing disintegration, if not dislocation, between nations. That has ramifications, of course, for supply chains. And we know what that means in terms of the inflationary impulse. So what we have right now is clearly much, much higher inflation than most policymakers and many economists, surprisingly enough, were anticipating. We see central banks are responding to that with much more restrictive monetary policy. At the same time, we now see the Russian invasion of Ukraine as amplifying the inflationary forces that had already erupted and had already surprised us to the upside. So if I can try and distill that down into a kind of short-term conclusion, regrettably, it is, Kerry, that we now face stagflation in many of the major regions of the world, the United States, in Europe, certainly, definitely in the United Kingdom. So we're now beginning to think through what does stagflation mean in terms of the financial markets? How can we protect ourselves from that? How do we weather the perfect storm that is a fusion and a confluence of both an extraordinary change in monetary policy, an extraordinary change in the inflationary landscape, an extraordinary change in the geopolitical landscape?
When you say stagflation, explain that for us as to how that will impact us. Because at the moment, lots of people are talking inflation, especially here in Australia. The numbers are coming out, which are bigger than we thought. Only this morning I was listening to the radio, and they were saying that electricity prices have doubled in 12 months. People are starting to get very concerned. But I'd like you just to unpack that stagflation statement a little bit as to how that will pan out.
Sure. So stagflation is a macroeconomic environment where you have a coincidence or a combination of slowing economic activity, if not recession, accompanied by high and persistently high inflation. And we all have memories, well, we won't have necessarily personal memories of stagflation in the 70s, but from an economics perspective, that's the reference point for comparative purposes. And in the 70s, of course, we had the oil shock following the Yom Kippur War of 1973. In response, at the latter part of the 70s, we had Paul Volcker, chairman of the Fed, who came out and ratcheted rates up. That created a recession to contain the high levels of inflation. Today, we've got central banks, particularly in the United States, of course, ratcheting up interest rates, and Jerome Powell, the chair of the Fed, looks like he's going to continue to do that for a while. That will serve to slow the economy. And so we're going to see slowing growth accompanied by very high inflation, because the inflationary environment has been amplified by the invasion of Ukraine via the food and energy markets. In fact, Kerry, just before we spoke, I was looking at the front cover of the very latest Economist, and I hate to admit this to your viewers. If I told you how long I've read or been a subscriber to The Economist, you'd know full well how boring I am. But I've been reading The Economist for 40 years, and I urge everyone to have a look at the latest Economist. It's all about the coming food famine and catastrophe. We really need to get our heads around this. We are right on the doorstep of a global food and energy crisis.
Yep.
And we know Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. We know that between Russia and Ukraine, they supply so much of the foodstuffs, the fertilizers, and the energy mix, LNG, coal, and also oil. So we really need to get our heads around this, that inflation has moved up very sharply. Central banks, yes, are now looking to restore their credibility. And this is a very important point. The central banks are so slow in responding to this inflation that was emerging earlier last year. Yeah. They're now in a desperate attempt to restore their credibility, Kerry. They're ratcheting up rates. So my view as well here is the central banks kept interest rates too low for too long. They now risk the prospect of keeping rates too high for too long. And there's quite a lot of irony in that, but I think that's what's going to unfold in the next 12 months.
So what do you think people should be doing? But first of all, I totally agree with you. I've been speaking about this for a while, that we need to understand it's the global supply chain has been massively interrupted. And we only saw this week that India is restricting exporting of wheat as well. So this is going to get pretty interesting pretty quickly, and people need to sit up and take some notice. But are we protected here in Australia a little bit more?
We are, to a certain extent, and I've certainly viewed that, expressed that view in my report a few months ago, that in amidst all of everything we've just been discussing, Australia is certainly, on a relative basis, somewhat of a safe haven. Certainly in terms of the energy mix, in terms of LNG, obviously in terms of coal, but also the agricultural commodities, absolutely critical. I mean, if I started telling you what tomato prices in Egypt have done in the last few months, everyone would roll their eyes. But I mean, in the last year, tomatoes are up 89% in Egypt. I could list right across the emerging world the rapid hyperinflation in food inflation. Here in Australia, we're not seeing it anywhere to the same extent. So in that fundamental regard, we are somewhat protected. I would hasten to add, though, if I can just put one little point in here. I've been trying to make this point for years here in Australia. We have incredibly low levels of inventories in terms of, gasoline, petrol and diesel stocks, about 19 days worth, which I think is criminal. We won't dwell on that, but, so we are vulnerable there. But ultimately, we're in a better place in terms of certainly the global supply chains with regard to food and some of the basic energy sources. So yes, Australia is somewhat of a safe haven, but we're not going to be immune to this.
No, I don't think we'll be immune to it. But one of the things I also want to ask you is, you are going to be coming to talk at the Australian Gold Conference, which is on June the 15th at Crown in Sydney. What I'd like you to just share with our listeners a little bit, what are you going to cover and why is it? Because I think it's absolutely critical that they come along. If they can't come for the 2 days, they need to come and listen to what you've got to say. It is the Gold Conference. We will be looking at money per se and inflation and the macro picture, but give us a flavor of what you're going to be covering.
Well, sure. I mean, a lot of the essence of it is that this new geopolitical reality has very profound investment implications. First of all, let's just acknowledge there's been this dislocation, this disruption in terms of the fabric, the architecture of the geopolitical structure around the world. What does that mean? It means further disintegration, dislocation, and tension between what we could best describe as autocracies and democracies. So that's a fundamental shift. And that is also inflationary, because globalization was for many decades disinflationary. Right. And now we've got a rupture in that. And we've got this basic demarcation between these two blocks, ideological blocks in the world, which I think is going to probably get worse before it gets better. And that in of itself is inflationary. Central banks respond to that. So a lot of your traditional assets, I mean, equity markets don't perform well in stagflationary environments. And we know that. We can look at the history. Then the fixed income markets, the bond markets, which has absorbed such a stunning amount of money in the last decade or so, they don't tend to perform well either. Yes, I know I'm speaking at a gold conference, but the historical record is unambiguous. The only asset pretty much that performs well in a stagflationary environment, and moreover, when we see a crash in equity markets, every equity crash since 1987, and I won't go through each of them and how much the equity markets fell, but in each and every of those episodes, gold massively, and I mean massively, outperformed equities. And also, if you then overlay a stagflationary environment on top of those equity crashes, and that would take us back into the 70s, gold performed well in that environment as well. So I know I'm speaking at a gold conference, so it sounds like I'm talking my book. I hasten to add, Kerry, and I think you know this because we've known each other a while, I'm not a gold bug.
No, you're not.
There are times when, gold has, a reasonably important place in a global portfolio. So in terms of portfolio construction, and I consult to a lot of investment committees, and this is what we struggle with every week. How do we build and design investment portfolios that best weather the kind of environment that we are now in? But the first thing to do there, Kerry, is to convince people we're actually in that environment. And, Mark Twain, one of our favorite authors, of course, Kerry, he once said, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. Yes. And I've always loved, I love that phrase.
Yeah.
The fund management community, and I speak to them all the time, are still in denial about this change and rupture in the global economy. They still think that we're in this low inflation, low interest rate world. I think that's beginning to change now. They've had a bit of a rude shock. But conversations last year, Kerry, when I was talking about the prospect of higher inflation, and we know all the reasons why that has erupted, the fund management community continued with this I don't know what you want to call it, this opinion that inflation was transitory,
Yes.
nothing had really changed, because of course the central banks were saying that. And Kerry, you know, you and I go back a long time. I'll never forget the lead up to the great crash of 2008. Ben Bernanke saying that the subprime debacle in the United States was just an isolated affair, wouldn't have any long-term implications, implying it was transitory. And now, of course, Jerome Powell 2 years ago starts with this phrase that inflation is transitory, which was then echoed by every central banker across the planet. And the fund management community said, oh, happy days. That means I can remain fully invested. I don't have to change a thing. You know, everything's going to be hunky-dory. And they're now beginning to wake up to this new investment reality. But then, of course, Ukraine happened. So it's like a double whammy for the investment community. They're saying, wow, the inflationary landscape has changed fundamentally. The monetary policy landscape has changed. And now the geopolitical landscape has changed. So now we're in the process of thinking through all of that. And that's what I will share with your audience in Sydney next month.
Jonathon Payne, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you. And I'm so excited that you're going to come along and talk to our audience. It is critical to have a listen to people like Jonathon, who has been talking about inflation since before back when people were saying it's not going to happen, it's only transitory. He has been saying, raising the red flag, warning people. And what I'm passionate about, ladies and gentlemen, is to make sure that you listen to people like Jonathon and that you understand how to protect your portfolio going forward and potentially not only protect it, but grow it as we go through these very challenging times. Jonathon Payne, we will look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, the 15th of June. But for now, thanks for joining me on the Gold News Channel.
Thank you, Kerry.